Started. Let's see.
We're ready to go. Thank you.
Let's see. So can you all see my screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. Have a look. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about today I'm going to talk about Ice Age fauna and mammalian evolution. And feel free to shoot any questions at any point in the talk. I'm okay with like dealing with any of the subjects that are presented here more in detail. I'm going to be talking mostly about mammoths and DNA and what we know from ancient DNA. But I'm going to also cover fossils and loads of other topics. So let's get started. So let's quickly move back to about 50,000 years ago, when most of the area that we now know as Western Europe and Eastern Europe and Siberia was covered in this new ecosystem called the Mammoth steppe. So if all the areas which are now mostly forest, areas in Siberia which are forested, all the way through Alaska, which are also forested, all those areas were grassland. And they were inhabited by these large elephant-like creatures, mammoths, and different species of horse which are now extinct, as well as different species of cat, large cats like cave lions and saber-toothed cats. And what does this picture remind you of? So this picture looks a little bit like a frozen version of the African savanna. So you have the elephants, which are also in the savanna, you have the lions, which are present in the savanna, and you have the rhino, you have the horses, which you would find the equivalent nowadays in the zebra. So you have all these animals which look a little bit like the African savanna, but these are species that are adapted to the cold. So all of this part of the world was covered in a savanna-like environment. And effectively, all the species were there, but the version of the species or the variant of the species that was most adapted to the cold. And it's important to understand this because where the mammoth is from, the ecosystem that the mammoth was part of, is a crucial part to sort of understanding why it went extinct. So let's ask the first question for this talk. So who or what were the relatives of the mammoth? So the woolly mammoth, did not come straight out of the elephant family. There's some intermediate species, and there's some relatives of a mammoth which we know of. So Mammuthus primigenius is a woolly mammoth, but there's also the steppe mammoth, which is much larger, which is larger even than the African elephant. And then there's the southern mammoth, the Columbian mammoth, which was mostly present in the lower 48 states of the United States, and the American mastodon, which many of you will have heard of, which is a slightly different species from a slightly different branch of the family. And then the pygmy mammoth, which many of these are found, for example, in small islands off the coast of California. So you have all these different types of elephants. And let's try to understand how different they were. So this blue mammoth, this blue picture, blue silhouette of a mammoth, that's the Columbian mammoth. But you have other mammoths which are similar size or bigger, and then you have this small mammoth, which is barely the same height as a person. And so just to understand the huge difference in size, which this family spanned. So what do we know from mammoth DNA, right, about these different species? So you could ask, you know, the science of DNA has expanded in the last 20 years. And what have we found about mammoth DNA? What's the genetics of the mammoth? And so using mammoth DNA, you can trace different branches of the family. So we know that the woolly mammoth branched out from a close relative of the Asian elephant. So the Asian elephant is currently the closest species to the woolly mammoth. And slightly further away, you have the African savanna elephant, and then the African forest elephant, which is lesser known, but they're both from the genus Loxodonta. And then on this completely different branch, you have the American mastodon, right, which has a completely different diet, completely different environment. So the American mastodon is mostly adapted to forests, to consuming things like pine cones, whereas the woolly mammoth was mostly adapted to grassland. And they all go back to this ancestor, the Gomphotherium, going back millions of years. So the most recent large study on mammoth DNA is also the largest study ever done. It's the largest study ever done on DNA from millions of years ago. So this is the oldest animal DNA that's ever been analyzed. Okay, this came out in Nature in 2021, and what it found was that there's evidence of multiple different interactions. So we know that the elephant family originated from the Elephas genus, originated from Africa, and then spread throughout Eurasia. However, you also have the mammoth branch, which spread from Africa through Eurasia and to America. Now, we know that these two branches separated, but what we didn't know was that there's actually a relationship here. There's some crossover between the mammoths in Siberia and the mammoths in North America. There actually seems to be some relationship, and all of that has to do with the opening of the Bering, with the land that was Beringia, that is now the Bering Strait. And so what you see is there's a genetic exchange, there's interbreeding occurring later on, about 0.5 million years ago, between the woolly mammoth and the Columbian mammoth, and how they interacted. So that's an interesting fact. What else have we found? So in general, from mammoth DNA, the first study that was ever done was in 2005, 2006. And what happened was they analyzed the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is a small part of the cell which generates energy, and it has a bit of DNA. And so this DNA in the mitochondria was really easy to analyze. It's a short span of DNA. And so what happened was different teams of researchers analyzed this one first, analyzed this DNA, which was the easy DNA to obtain, and found that there's a close relationship between the woolly mammoth and the Asian elephant, right? So it's a close species. So if you were going to bring back the woolly mammoth, which is something I'm going to talk about later in this presentation, you would actually want to use Asian elephant DNA because it's the closest relative. Now, slightly further down the line, analysis was done across the whole of the genome, so not just the mitochondria, but the whole of the DNA that's in each cell of the woolly mammoth and of Asian elephants. And we found out certain things. So we found that the African elephant branched away about 6 million years ago, which is similar to the split between chimpanzees and humans. And we also know that the divergence occurred between the mammoth and the Asian elephant between 5.8 and 7.8 million years ago. Now, we know that even though the woolly mammoth and the African elephant are quite different, because the Asian elephant is closer to the woolly mammoth than the African elephant, they're still actually quite close in terms of DNA. So there's a 98 to 99% identical DNA between the woolly mammoth and the African elephant. So these changes that you see in terms of size, that you see in terms of the hair, these are changes which are relatively small compared to the broader changes that you have in the genome. So the relationship between different strands of mammoth and modern elephants are a bit similar to the relationships between us and chimpanzees. You have obviously a lot of changes in the DNA, but not enough to change a huge percentage of it. So these are 98%, 99% similarities. Okay, and here's just a diagram of DNA. But the message that I want to convey here is it's not that hard. It wouldn't be that hard to modify an Asian elephant to try to get it to have hair, to try to get it to have different cold adaptations. And why, you might ask? Well, because the DNA is 98 to 99% similar. And I see you have a question in the chat. Where was the DNA recovered from? Teeth, bone, frozen flesh, or somewhere else? So typically, it's from flesh, and sometimes from frozen teeth. But this is, you could say, well, why can't I use my fossils to get DNA? Well, most of the time when a mammoth tooth fossilizes or when mammoth flesh fossilizes, it becomes mineralized. And so the DNA obviously deteriorates and ends up like the rest of the tissue becoming part of a mineral of a rock. And that is no longer really DNA. It no longer has this sort of double helix, which you can sequence. So the only way you can get mammoth DNA is when it's frozen. So when you have frozen flesh from a mammoth, and it's kept in a cave, for example, typically in Russia and Siberia in a cave, and it's frozen continually for the last 10,000 years or more, then it will be preserved. And then you can take that frozen DNA and that frozen flesh and extract DNA and analyze it. So it needs to be frozen meat, frozen flesh. It can't be a fossilized or mineralized tissue. Does that make sense? Okay. So I think we've sorted that question out. Feel free to chip in verbally as well if you think that you have another question. So let's see. Perfect. Okay, so that's answered. So yeah, so we need frozen material for mammoths, and that's actually very hard to find. So mammoth teeth and different mammoth fossilized bones can be found, but finding frozen mammoth flesh that's still frozen is actually quite difficult, and it's extremely valuable from a scientific perspective. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the differences between the mammoths and elephants. So obviously, in size, they're quite similar. The Asian elephant, Elephas maximus, is slightly smaller than the woolly mammoth. Then the African elephant is kind of the same size. And what I want to convey is, if we did bring back the woolly mammoth, if somebody did modify an Asian elephant to make it like the woolly mammoth, the infrastructure that we'd have to have, we would have to have similar infrastructure in terms of size, in terms of transport, in terms of all these other things to the Asian elephant and partly to the African savanna elephant. So they're generally in the same range. Now let's talk about fossils. So this is the Fossil Club, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how can you tell what species of mammoth my particular tooth is, or particular fossil is. So as you've seen in the presentation here, there's a lot of different types of mammoth. Okay, so you have the woolly mammoth, which is Mammuthus primigenius. Then you have Mammuthus exilis, which is a pygmy mammoth. You have Columbi, which is the Columbian mammoth. And then you have Trogontheri, which is the steppe mammoth. This is actually, this one's actually the biggest. I don't know if this is immediately apparent from this picture. And then you have the southern mammoth, which is this gray image here. So how can I, so one of your questions might be, how can I tell I have a mammoth tooth, but I don't know which one of these species it is? And so the answer is count the ridges. So you can do complex analyses like the Nature paper that I showed before did, to look at the different lamellar length and hypsodonty index, and like looking at different features of these teeth to try to tell apart different fine differences in between mammoths. But the long story short is count the ridges. So depending on the number of ridges that your tooth has, it will be one species or another. And we know this, the very first mammoth that was ever found, that ever arose on the earth, was the Mammuthus romanus. Okay, so this mammoth basically it entered Europe about 3 million years ago, and it only had 8 to 10 ridges. So if you find teeth from that mammoth, and here in the background is an example, it will only have 8 to 10 ridges in a tooth. Now, the southern mammoth, the meridionalis, and then the steppe mammoth, they have a higher higher number of ridges, so they end up with more ridges per tooth. And obviously, eventually, you end up with the woolly mammoth, which is 26 ridges. So if you have a mammoth tooth, count the ridges, and you will very clearly be able to tell what species it is. And you might be surprised. I expect that most people's teeth, if people have mammoth teeth, will be woolly mammoth, because that's the most recent one, and it's very common. But it could also be steppe mammoth or other types of mammoth. So definitely something worth keeping in mind. Let's see. So the steppe mammoth was very different from the woolly mammoth, because it was slightly larger, and as you can see, it has a slightly different tusk shape. The bone structure is similar. The head slightly more domed here at the top. So think of a slightly larger and sort of more imposing creature than the woolly mammoth. So woolly mammoth is just a little bit smaller, and there's clearly a strong curvature of the tusks that you have in the woolly mammoth, which is not so apparent in the steppe mammoth. So you can see slight differences in body and in skeletal structure. Now, there's something which wasn't known until a couple of years ago, which is that we do know that there's some ghost populations which were related to the Columbian mammoth, which we've never found. So a ghost population in genetics is when you can tell from the DNA sequence that there's like a separate group of individuals from that species which have never been mapped, but which are found because of admixture patterns. And so I'm going to explain what that means. So we know that when this paper analyzed Columbian mammoth DNA, it predicted its relationship to the other mammoths that we have. So for example, the woolly mammoth, and then the African elephant, which is not a mammoth, but which is another species of elephant. And so we can try to piece back the family history. And what this paper found was, when you try to piece back the family history, you find that there's some ghost regions which are indicative of a species which we have never heard of before. So we know that there's a species that we haven't classified, that we haven't got DNA for, but that is predicted by the model to exist for the Columbian mammoth. So this family tree that I was showing you before, this family tree with the different types of mammoth, and especially the Columbian mammoth and the spread, there's a separate element of that family tree. There's a new branch, but we don't know exactly what that mammoth was. So we need to find fossils and we need to find flesh for that mammoth, but it's predicted by the genetic models, and it's considered a ghost population. So we know that about half of the Columbian mammoth genome is actually from this ghost population, which is unrelated to the woolly mammoth. So I think this is fascinating, and it sort of indicates that there's a lot that we don't know. Now, where did mammoths live? So I've described the mammoth steppe, which occupied this blue region here. Obviously, Beringia was covered in ice, and actually there was land as well. And so you could actually cross all the way from the northern parts of Alaska all the way to Siberia, and then to England and Spain. So you could go all the way through the mammoth steppe. And here's a diagram showing the sort of the spread of different mammoths across this steppe. You do notice that it becomes diminished about 6,000 years before present. It does become quite diminished because of several factors, including human expansion and ecological change. So there was a slight change in that environment. The grasslands, which I showed you before, became gradually taken over by woodland and by icy, by non-grassland. So essentially tundra and taiga. They got taken over by the modern ecosystems. So this magnificent land, which was the mammoth steppe, where you have ancient horses, where you have all kinds of different types of bison, and then you have the mammoth. This land became no more. So there are a few parts of the world that still remain a little bit in this type of ecosystem. So they look a little bit like this land. So this is the Altai-Sayan area in Central Asia, and there's a few parts of the world nowadays which resemble the mammoth steppe, and so they look a bit like this. It's dry grassland, and you do have some water, and you do have sort of barren non-tree landscape. And that's exactly what the mammoth steppe would have looked like according to our models. Let's have a look at the question. So would Egyptians have seen mammoths? So that's a very good question. So when we go back to this this map here, so these maps show that about 6,000 years ago you do have a push to the north. I want to caution that this is a probabilistic map, but most of our data shows that mammoths were really pushed to the far north by then. There were some mammoths that remained until about 6,000 years ago on an island called Wrangel Island, which is off the northeasternmost tip of Siberia. And yes, so the Egyptians, if the Egyptians had crossed the whole of Siberia and then crossed the icy seas, they would have encountered an island with some very diminished mammoths, because these mammoths were a small population, and gradually, because of the thing in genetics that we know as population collapse, were essentially dying because of inbreeding. And so if the Egyptians had crossed all that territory, they would have found that island. However, there's relatively limited evidence of such a type of migration. We do know that North Siberians did encounter mammoths, and I'm going to show some examples of mammoth art, humans painting mammoths. So maybe people would have seen them very far north. Correct. So the people did encounter mammoths all the time in the north, and there's no written accounts of mammoths in prehistory. But if they had been, then maybe there are some accounts which are in a language written maybe in stone, which is yet to be found. But this is currently speculation. We don't have evidence of written accounts of mammoths. What we do have is art. And so I'm going to show you some examples of mammoth art. So this is where the Altai-Sayan area is. So this would be an area nowadays that still resembles the mammoth steppe a bit. So let's talk about mammoths in art. So there are some drawings, cave drawings of mammoth. Here's a classic a cave drawing of the woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius. And I mean, you could say, well, how do you know what they look like? Well, I mean, we have art. We also have models and frozen mammoths, and especially mammoths with skin, which have been found. So we do know what they look like. And other examples of art are this other cave silhouette. And finally, we do have some sculptures. So this is a sculpture. I think it's from Central Asia, and essentially, depicting a woolly mammoth clearly. With the grooves and the skin and the hair. So we do have art. So we know that humans constantly interacted with mammoths, but we don't have written accounts. So that's kind of a bit of a pity, really. Yeah. So let's talk about a very controversial topic, which is future aims, bringing the woolly mammoth back. So as you know, or as you may have heard, there's a company called Colossal, which is run by George Church, which is very famous in the world of genetics, especially for working on the human genome back in the day. And Colossal has the main aim of bringing back the woolly mammoth, and using new genome editing and ancient DNA-based readings and other types of technology to really bring back, modify the Asian elephant and bring back the woolly mammoth. And they're very specific on what their aims are. So they want to generate a cold-resistant elephant that has all of the core biological traits of the woolly mammoth. Now, what do they mean by this? They mean that they're going to get an Asian elephant, an Asian elephant genome, and modify it to be resistant to the cold. Does that mean it will be exactly a woolly mammoth? No, it doesn't mean it'll be genetically exactly like a woolly mammoth, but it does mean that it will occupy the ecological space of the woolly mammoth. So they're going to try to make an elephant, a modern elephant, that's as similar as possible to the woolly mammoth without using the exact woolly mammoth genome. So it will walk like one, it will look like one and sound like one, and will be able to occupy the same ecosystem, but it won't be genetically identical to one. And this is very important because the woolly mammoth genome is not that well understood. We know some things about its history, but we don't know how every single part of it functions. And these people at Colossal are being very pragmatic, and they're saying, you know, we just want to generate something that works like a woolly mammoth, but it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly letter for letter identical to the genome of the woolly mammoth. And so I don't know what your thoughts are. I mean, in general, there's 10 goals which are given, you know, to sort of justify bringing back the mammoth. I would understand that some people would be against this. So the reasons that are given are to decelerate melting of the permafrost, restoring the mammoth step, which is ecosystem, which I showed to you before. And the idea would be to prevent the emission of greenhouse gases, and to transform the environment that the mammoths were in, to effectively capture or sequester more carbon. And yeah, and obviously there's an aim to improve technology to create resilience when we lose species, to create that technology to bring them back. So the main argument that they're giving is, what if we lose the African elephant? Will we be able to bring it back? Do we have a system in place to bring back key species? And how can we develop that system? And so they're using the mammoth as a proof of concept, to essentially develop a technology to bring back extinct species. So these are the reasons given. Let's see, I think we have a question. Yeah. How does it decelerate Arctic melting? It's a good question. So the theory behind this interaction between the mammoth and the environment is that it will generate a sort of a grassland type environment, and that will capture a lot more carbon. And the idea is that the capture of all that carbon would globally reduce greenhouse gas effect. So it would prevent the emission of greenhouse gases, and therefore would kind of overturn or prevent the overheating of essentially the planet. So they talk about 600 million tons of net carbon. So the proposal that they're giving is, let's transform the Arctic ecosystem to make it more efficient, to make it capture a lot more carbon, to turn it into something like this, which has constant grassland. And you could say, well, what about a pine forest? Isn't that going to be more carbon? Well, actually, grassland does tend to produce a lot of carbon material every year, and then it becomes embedded in the ground. So there's this, it might seem counterintuitive, but these models show that grassland is actually expected to sequester more carbon than a somewhat stagnant pine forest. So their theory is, if we bring back the woolly mammoth, it will be able to transform part of the Siberian environment, part of the Northern American environment, and then it will actually help sequester more carbon. Now, this is their reason, the reason that they give. Yeah, it's unclear whether I haven't seen the exact models that they're using for carbon capture, but the reason that they give is this. These were evolved as cold weather animals. Wouldn't the future possibly be much hotter than now? Not suitable for them. Good point. So animals were adapted to exceptionally cold climates. The expectation is that Colossal will design a mammoth that is adapted to current Arctic climates, but not obviously the climates that we have in for example in the Maryland area. So the answer is, mammoths were adapted to the extreme cold. They will design a mammoth which is adapted to areas, for example, what is now Alaska, what is now Siberia. But obviously they will fine-tune that to make sure that they don't, that this animal survives in those environments. Now, because global warming is going to happen and the world is going to go up by 1 or over 1 degree Celsius, we do know that the world is going to warm up, but the expectation is that the mammoths will probably migrate north. If southern parts, for example, of Alaska become too warm, they will move to the north. And if southern parts of Siberia become too warm, they will move to the north. So the expectation is that these mammoths will be able to survive in that environment. And we know that mammoths were capable of migrating huge distances, much like modern day elephants. So it's not completely unexpected to think that could happen. Yeah. However, the exact justifications that are given and why Colossal argues that we should do this, I mean, I personally have reservations as to how possible that's going to be. Why? Well, because we know that in part the ecological change since the last ice age really pushed the mammoths hard and actually allowed for their extinction. So it's kind of hard to argue that a species that became extinct partly through climate change can reverse climate change. So my personal opinion is that it's going to be very difficult for the mammoths to change their environment without human support and without constant human intervention. So it may be that we can turn some areas of Siberia or Alaska or northern Canada into grassland via interaction with mammoths, but it's definitely not going to be easy. It's going to be a very, very challenging project. And I personally think that the argument about bringing species back and developing the technology is a stronger argument than saying that we're going to affect the climate. I mean, I think it's a very the climate argument is very it's very current, but I don't think it's the strongest argument that they have. Yeah. Feel free to chip in also with verbal questions if you.
So,
Yeah.
I have a question, Charles, which I'm not sure how to express, and it has to do with not to sound all granola or anything, but I guess the ethics of this. And I'm wondering, like, for
Right.
example, do they plan to bring back just one mammoth? Given what we know about how animals exist in social groups, in cultures, how can they bring back a dozen mammoths so that they can have some sort of continuing mammoth society? The thought of like one elephant being the last of its kind, for example,
It's unethical.
seems
Yeah, it's unethical.
right. So what has there been some attention to this?
Right, and so their argument, the argument that they give is that obviously this mammoth is going to be effectively there's going to be a fertilization, or more importantly, there's going to be an insertion of this mammoth embryo inside of an Asian elephant. So it's going to be born of an Asian elephant or a modified Asian elephant, and so it's going to have a mother and potentially a group of Asian elephants around it. Now, we don't know how much those Asian elephants are going to accept this mammoth as one of their own. It's going to be hairy and it's going to be related, but it's going to be slightly different. And so we don't know what kind of reception this mammoth will have. There is a big debate on bringing species back because we don't know, once a species is out there and in the wild, we don't know how it will affect an ecosystem. So George Church was famous back in the day because he once argued that we should bring back the Neanderthal, which is, as you know, a variant of hominid closely related to us. And the ethics of that is absolutely abysmal, right? I mean, how are you going to convince a person to become the mother of a Neanderthal that you're trying to bring back from extinction, right?
That individual would be at home nowhere. We would shun it, presumably.
Well, correct. Although, yeah, I mean, we don't know how humans would react to a Neanderthal. We don't know if it's even possible. We know that human Neanderthal admixture happened in the past because we were related to Neanderthals, but we also know that it was extremely inefficient because many babies didn't survive when humans bred with Neanderthals about over 10,000 years ago. So the argument that you want to bring an ancient species back has huge ethical implications, and I'm actually quite grateful you brought that up because will this pass ethical clearance? How should this company file for ethical clearance? So normally when you're doing a medical study, you will have to file for ethical clearance with the NIH and with your institutional review boards. But how can this study justify its experimentation? And the arguments they give are, greenhouse gases and ecological change. But does that justify bringing a woolly mammoth back? Potentially to a family that doesn't even want it. What are the ethics there, right? And I think that's a very big question. I don't have the answers to all of those questions, but I do think that it's something we need to think about. I mean, is this a good move? Should we be allowing this, right? And I assume that this should be brought back to essentially the people that are going to be most affected by this. So do the people who are in the Arctic environments, do they have an interest in bringing the woolly mammoth back, or do they think it's a horrible idea? I mean, the people who live in these parts are going to be some of the major communities affected by these animals. So I think we should really be asking them. Colossal is based in Boston, but well, in the US. But I mean, obviously, there should be some canvassing of Arctic environments, because if this mammoth is going to live mostly in the grasslands of Siberia and northern Canada and Alaska, we should really ask the people there, are you okay with bringing this species back? Yeah, I think that's a key question. Yeah.
Would they say yes just to hunt them to extinction again?
Well, that's a good question. So, as you know, there is hunting that occurs in the Arctic, notoriously of the walrus and other large animals. And would humans hunt them to extinction again? Well, that's a big question. You've actually touched another key area, which is if we bring back one woolly mammoth, will it also die of inbreeding if we only bring back a couple more mammoths and they start breeding with each other? That's a very small group, right? We know that functionally in most species, you need at least 1,000 members of a species for it to be viable genetically, right? So if you have fewer than 1,000 members, the species will survive for the next few years, but will end up dying of inbreeding because there's not enough variety in the DNA to continue. And so for the mammoth, how many mammoths are we going to bring back? Is it going to be a functional ecosystem, or is it going to just be a stunt, right, done by a biotechnology company to make money, right? This is the key question. How serious are we about bringing the species back, and do we have the infrastructure to bring back enough mammoths and to protect those mammoths and to look after the future of that environment? Those are very big questions, and I think there's a little bit of the publicity stunt here. I mean, I think it's an extremely capable company, but is this the best decision for the northern parts of the American continent and of Siberia? Is this the best decision, or is it just showing that we can do this? Just because we can do this, should we do this? I'm not sure. So these are questions which I think really we should be involved in, especially northern communities should be involved in, and the company should really have to deal with these local communities. So yeah, this is a complex environment, and we really need to make sure that we're not making a mistake. Yeah. Perfect. Well, I think we're close to the time. There's a bit more time for questions if anybody wants to chip in. But I think these are very key topics. And in terms of the de-extinction of the mammoth, bringing the mammoth back, there's also similar projects to bring back the thylacine and other species which have become extinct. So yeah, thank you very much. And if you have any more questions, feel free to chip in. Okay, so Eugene and Rita. Okay, who wants to go first?
I believe those are one person essentially.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, go ahead. Hello, can you hear? Oh, I think I can hear now.
The ethics of bringing back the woolly mammoth is will be far easier and can be done at a much more gradual pace than, for example, bringing back a small, fast reproducing rodent, or bringing back a pathogenic bacterium or virus for humans, because mammoths may take 20 to 25 years to reproduce in a generation. They're easy to find.
Right.
Unlike the rodents that get out of control, and certainly unlike bacteria. But it does raise very good questions about what we can do to save those far northern regions, which are now defrosting. They're thawing earlier than usual in spring because of soot, airborne carbon from cargo ships and from very inefficient coal-fired electrical plants in China, and to some extent in India. And they have a much larger impact than carbon dioxide does in those areas. So bringing back a grassland there is a really interesting way to deal with that.
Right, with carbon capture. So I mean, I think the arguments are there. I'm just worried about scale, because as you know, the mammoth is easier to track than a rodent, obviously. But the mammoths, I mean, an adult mammoth could live up to 60 years or more. And so are we going to have enough mammoths by the time we finish this project? If it's going to take 30 or at least 20 years for each generation, is it going to be a timely project for global warming, which, as we know, is happening very quickly, right? Or will be happening very quickly during the next 100 years. So, I mean, will we be able to prevent some of that with a species that reproduces so slowly? And I've got doubts about that. I do think there's obviously ways in which we can increase the number using genetic technologies, but I'm wary about, it should just be our main strategy. What's the reason for doing this? Are we really doing this for global warming? Or are we doing this because we are interested in de-extinction and we're interested in bringing species back? So yeah, I think the de-extinction argument is a lot stronger. I think the global warming argument is compelling from when you look at it at the beginning, but when you look at the timelines, for me, I think we need something much faster.
Yeah,
we need to prevent global warming in a much more efficient way.
Yeah, and I agree. To have enough mammoths to cover hundreds of thousands of square miles, are we looking at 300 years to 500 years?
Right. We're looking at big numbers. So yeah, it will be complicated, and you could increase the number much faster using cloning, but with cloning they're going to be very similar or potentially similar. You could do some kind of cloning technology in which you modify them, but the answer is it's not going to be done within the next 10 years. And the change that we're going to, I really believe that if we do big change, we could actually prevent some parts of global warming from happening, or we could try to prevent the damage as much as possible. And that's what I think we need to be doing mostly. This 300-year-long project is a good project, but it shouldn't be our main focus, because we don't have the time. Yeah.
If I could ask
Why
one
is the elephant the only thing? Why is the mammoth? Why, if you really wanted to terraform it, could we not maybe breed bison, which already have massive herds, and adapt them to cold instead of trying to resurrect the elephant?
There's a lot of interesting science which I haven't mentioned about why the mammoth is ideal. So it does a thing, it compresses the ground a lot better than bison, so because it weighs a lot more. And so the compression of the ground has a lot to do with the sequestering of the carbon. So ground compression, consumption of the grasslands, and also creation of the grasslands, because with the curved tusks, mammoths did a lot of digging into the snow, and a sort of consumption of the grass and moving of the earth as well. So the compression of earth is actually very important for carbon capture. Right. And so this is why they say that the mammoth has a slight edge over the bison, but the very large steppe bison are not unimportant. So I think it would be important to effectively aim at the ecosystem in general, because the one thing that I wanted to point out in this talk is that the woolly mammoth did not live on its own. It lived as part of a big ecosystem. And so, how can we really sort of make it feel at home? I mean, there's obviously some roles of the bison in that environment. It was all part of a connected environment. So bringing just the mammoth may be a very superficial effort. What we really probably need to do is bring back different parts of the mammoth steppe. And I mean, obviously there were predators there as well, which consumed some of these animals and kept them at bay. Should we bring back the predators, the cave lion, the saber-toothed cat? Should we bring back those as well? And so it becomes a very complicated problem, because bringing back one species sounds easy, or at least relatively easy compared to these others. But the moment you realize it's part of an environment, how much are we really just treating this as a simple problem when it's really a very complicated problem? And so, yeah, the cave lion will be hard to bring back, I think. Yeah.
And if I could ask an additional question, are there animals that you think of, or plants that would be better candidates or really good candidates for de-extinction that you would like to discuss further? What do you think of that?
Yes, I think there's other candidates which are quite good. I mean, the thylacine is always given as the best candidate for de-extinction. I'm going to show a picture this animal, because this animal was actually present all the way through until the last 100 or so years. So if you can all see my screen, this is a thylacine. It's a bit like the answer, the marsupial answer to a dog. So can you see it here? It's yeah. So you have these different. It's related to Tasmanian devil, and so you have this sort of dog-like creature which has these stripes across the back, which are rather startling. And so the thylacine, we do have evidence of thylacines from early history of Tasmania, Australia. So we do have a sort of, we do know the species. We know when it became extinct. It became extinct around the turn of the last 100 years. Here's some pictures of actual thylacines in black and white. And so this is probably the best candidate. Why? Well, because it's probably an even better candidate than mammoth, because this animal was, its ecosystem is actually still there. So you could actually still put it in an environment in Tasmania, in Australia, where it could live, and it could live happily. So the thylacine is probably a better example than the mammoth, because the mammoth steppe is relatively scarce. So the Altai Mountains, keeping mammoths there, it would be possible to keep them in that area, but to keep mammoths in Siberia, they would have to transform some parts of the Siberian environment. So the answer is there are better candidates out there. Yeah, and thank you for asking that question, because the mammoth isn't the best candidate, it's just the most flashy candidate. Yeah. I mean, everybody likes mammoths. I find them absolutely fascinating, but they are the sort of eye-catching, the sort of headline-catching animal. But there's other animals which are sort of better suited to de-extinction. The problem with the thylacine is that the thylacine is not, it's a marsupial, so it's not a sort of standard mammal. And so with the problems that we have really are, you know, how to work with the cells of the thylacine, how to get a similar species and work on it. We know that the Asian elephant is a good model for the mammoth, but what is our good model for the thylacine, right? How can we work with it? So there are some small marsupials which are sort of good models for the thylacine, or better models than using, for example, an actual mammal. So, but it's still work in progress. Marsupials usually get less biological coverage than mammals, because they're just only in Australia, and yeah, and our understanding of them is more limited. So yeah, no, this is it's a fascinating topic, and if we were going to do de-extinction, I'm sure that we could come up with candidates that are better suited. It's just that I think companies also tend to go for the flashy, the sort of attention-seeking element, especially for fundraising. So I think that's a factor. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, I think this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for your insightful questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
for being
Charles.
here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Any
Looking
other
forward to the next
questions?
talk. Yeah.
We'd love to have you back. That was really, really fascinating and a lot of important topics.
Definitely, and I'm looking forward to the next talk that's in February. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.